and I think by the time it got to be the end of the session, we knew that getting the line past the house was just the first issue. We then had to figure out, some people in that house can afford to pay $100 a month or more for internet service, or, you know, might be a little less, but some people can't afford that at all. And we knew that affordability. And when we were working on this, I mean, we still had kids doing online school. We do an awful lot of online medication and health and online mental health. And we wanted to do everything we could to make sure that every Vermonter, once we put the lines by their house, could afford to hook up to them. And for starters, we called back the usual suspects who had been in here 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least.
Yeah, I guess we really did get burned out.
Yeah, exactly.
But we thought we would take that back up because CUDs are up, they're running, and they're starting to streamline. And we need to talk about how, is there something we can do and what might it look like? And I know Tom and Holly, we also put a call into Capstone, but you were working with that group.
We have talked with them. I'll
Okay.
tell you about that.
Okay, because we haven't gotten anyone from there, but yeah.
Well,
They recommended that Casey join.
Yes.
Ah.
Casey.
From NECA. Okay. Hi. So, okay, you are on my agenda. My agenda gets improved without my noticing it. Okay. Good. All right. So we will go through that, and Tom will start with you.
Great.
And this shares back here, and this one is only reserved if there's staff. Okay.
Well, I'm Tom Richardson from Stowe. I remember that's how you
You're
started.
now my constituent, so that's changed.
That's right, that's right. That is a lot changed. I very much appreciate the fact that you're revisiting this now. The affordability is very important, and I'm grateful to you inviting me back to talk about that. I think it's the last thing that we all talked about 2 years ago. I had sent in some slides. Can they go up? Or? And I wasn't quite sure what you wanted me to talk about, so I prepared more than that, but I'll stick to affordability. because
Okay,
that's
that
what
would be
we're most
helpful, and if
interested
you've got some future topics, you
Sure.
can just let us know what we need
in.
to
No,
vote
no
for.
problem. And affordability is certainly a key issue. When we talk about affordability, though, I think it's important to point out that affordability means affordability not only in those areas where we're building now and where there isn't availability, but it also means affordability in the 65–70% of Vermont where there already is broadband available, but where it may not be affordable for everyone who has it. So in a sense, there may be more Vermonters who don't have broadband, and I don't have a statistic on this, but more Vermonters who don't have broadband because they can't afford it than those Vermonters who don't have broadband because they can't physically access it. Holly may know more about those statistics. We can go on to the next slide, please. So I'm not nearly as current as Holly will tell you more, I'm sure, that's current. I've been in telecommunications for most of my professional life. All of the old stuff is old, so it's
I was
obsolete.
gonna say, you started out as my constituent, and you,
That's right, that's right. I was in Worcester before I was in Montpelier, and then I was in Montpelier.
well, then I was in the city, so you weren't mine in Worcester.
The AT&T WorldNet service was interesting because we popularized all-you-can-eat internet pricing. Before that, it used to be priced by the hour. And we did it because we thought it was a way to sell the service. We were late to market behind AOL and other people people. We never realized the power of that, how important it was that people be online all the time. And that was just becoming important at the time. But it was a wake-up experience for me to see how important it is that people could be online all the time and not have to worry about running up a huge bill. Because they were worried, well, what if the kids leave it on and I have to pay for 1 million hours? And we, in a way, have the same problem with data caps today, not necessarily as bad. ITXC was a wholesale voice over IP before people had things like Skype, because people didn't have broadband at home. Because of voice over IP services for international calls, in the middle of international calls, the price for calling places like China or India went down from $1 a minute to about 2 cents a minute during a period of about 3 years. Basically, we broke an international cartel. But that made an enormous, and the reason that's important to us here at all is it made an enormous difference to the economies of those countries. Not only could people who'd left India and China to go work in other places afford to call home, but also businesses could be established. Globalization, in a way, depends very much on communication. It's a mixed blessing, but without communication, it simply wouldn't happen. So again, the price of communication, availability of communication, as you know, has enormous economic impact. I have managed to stay retired since I've been here last, but for fun and interest, I've been working on shareware to measure the quality of internet connections. And I also do that with my grandchildren just for fun. So I've been developing tools so that we can see whether an internet connection is as good as it claims to be, and in what dimensions it's good. So if we could go to the next slide. And actually, let's skip the next slide, that slide. Okay, great. So again, as I was saying, most people live in an area where there already is broadband access, but may not be able to afford it. There are a lot of programs available to help with affordability in areas where there's access. But there's a second barrier that people don't know what those programs are, and they don't know how to apply for those programs. They may not know what to do with internet access once they get it. And as we all know, the road out of poverty now requires, among other things, broadband access for schooling, for participation in the labor force, for health, for everything else. But subsidies are available. We could switch to the next slide. There's the federal program, which basically will pay $30 a month to people who are eligible for other federal programs. So that can bring the cost of service down substantially. On the next slide, and just as an example, but it's a good example for us because so much of the state is covered by Comcast. Comcast has a program where you can get access for less than $30 a month. If you put the Comcast program together with the federal program, which you can't do, then it basically means free internet for those people who meet the eligibility requirements. For people who are eligible for school lunch are eligible for both of those programs. So there are, and the Comcast program also includes a cheap computer. It includes free use of a Wi-Fi modem.
We'll share this slide with the education department. We are looking at free lunch, so.
This just came from the Comcast website, by the way, so this is not.
Tell them to check it out.
So, there's almost everything that you need to get online. It's not 100 by 100 like fiber, but I'd argue that 50-10 is enough to participate today. It's enough for Zooming, it's enough for streaming a couple of channels. And because we're not asking the consumer, or they're not asking the consumer to make any capital investment, the fact that that'll be obsolete someday really doesn't make any difference. Nobody's getting locked into it as long as they get the use out of it. What I've heard though, and part of my working on measurement is I've been online with the sort of national community of people who are concerned about broadband quality and accessibility. In other states, and not in Vermont, I haven't been doing much in Vermont, is that Comcast hasn't, although it's kept its word and made the program available, has not done a good job of teaching its own people about the program. So if somebody calls the local Comcast office, and again, I don't know that this is true in Vermont and in Massachusetts, for example, and says, hey, I want that low income program, they're liable not to get a very good responsive answer. But whoever picks up the phone first doesn't know what the program is, doesn't know how to get it. It's not helpful that there's a URL there for applying for the program if you don't have internet access. Maybe you can get to it on your
It's
phone.
like giving you a phone call, a phone number to call to get phone service.
Exactly. Or when your phone is down, just call this number.
Yeah,
Um, Let's go on to the next slide, which I'm not going to talk about because Holly's here and she can talk about it much better. So this is what I found when I Googled what low-income programs there were available from the cuts, but let's skip over that. Okay, what there is, as I was talking about with Comcast, is a knowledge barrier. People don't know that the program's available. Everybody here doesn't know that the program's available. Comcast doesn't have an enormous incentive. I'm not criticizing it because I think it's a good program, but they don't have an enormous incentive to publicize it. Their commission salespeople don't have any incentive to sell it. And so it's there, but there's a knowledge barrier that stops people from taking advantage of it. And there, again, Comcast covers, according to who you ask, maybe 65% of Vermont. So there are a lot of people who could take advantage of that program if they knew what it was and if they knew how to get through the application, if somebody would help them when the first person at Comcast says, oh no, there is no such program, or with help, they could get there. And even when they get there, they may not necessarily know how to take full advantage of being online without some tutoring in doing that. Okay, so let's skip on to the next slide. And this is sort of where we left 2 years ago. It seems to me, and what we were recommending then, is that there be funding for the CAP agencies to provide broadband, not to provide the access itself, but to provide the training and the help in getting access. The people who are eligible for these low-income programs are already clients of the CAP agencies. The CAP agencies know which ones need help with broadband and which don't. What they probably don't know but could learn is who serves what areas. So they would know if a client in one town asks for it, they're not going to be able to help because there physically isn't a provider at the moment. But if they're in Winooski, yeah, there is, and it's Comcast, and this is the number you call, and this is how you get your service. This is how you apply for the federal program. So the CAP agencies would have to come up to speed on what programs were available where. They'd have to come up to speed on how to fill out the forms. They're good at that stuff. They already know, again, they already know the people who have the needs, and they can help the people weave that internet access into the other solutions that the CAP agencies are providing. Use it for education, use it for healthcare, use it for connecting with the workforce, and even use it for trying to find childcare. So what we were recommending at the time, and we had talked to the CAP agencies who felt that they could provide it, not without additional funding, but that if they had additional funding, that they could provide both some centralized expertise who were area experts who knew what provider provided service at what address in their area, and they could provide that crucial aid to the people in getting connected and where it was needed, because they in general know where it was needed, the early training so that the people who did get connected would be able to get to the service. So I think if this session's the time to do it, that's wonderful. And we can leverage the federal money that's coming in. And again, I apologize, I'm not as up to date on all the different programs as I used to be, so I'm not sure which funds are
All we
restricted. and
know
what.
is that there's supposed to be federal money coming in, but there's some here, but not here. The question is, will the federal money be allowed to be used for
Exactly.
this, or does it's just for infrastructure?
Right,
And then the question is, and that goes across the hall, if the state, well, first, how much money, and then can it find it?
right. So I don't think there's an enormous amount of money, but I can't pretend that it's free either. If the agencies are gonna do something else, then it'll cost something to do it. It doesn't involve the state providing any additional subsidies in these cases. I think, and something Holly can speak to, and I had recommended a couple of years ago, that if providers are getting money from the state or through the state in order to build out, a requirement ought to be that they have a low-income program. So it's sort of trouble, and we know that what we've been hearing from the communications union districts is that this is a 5-year build out. So this is year 2 of the 5-year build out. There'd be trouble 5 years from now to find out, yeah, it got there, but I can't afford it. We really want to be sure, I think, when it gets to every address, that everybody at every address in Vermont can afford it. And we're liable to find that a lot of the customers that are left at the end of the road are the customers who can't afford service, because others may have already done something like get Starlink or get 5G service. They may want to hook up to the fiber because they think it's better, but the other people aren't going to have had those more expensive options. And so when we get to them, we want to make sure somehow there would seem to be a rough justice in saying if a provider gets money from the state or the feds and therefore doesn't have to raise that amount of capital, that the benefit of having gotten that capital should go at least partially to the low income people who are being served. So when you look at cost of service, you might say, well, this is how much it costs me actually to serve somebody, but that's allocating a part of the build out cost, and the part of the build out cost is provided by the state. Maybe I shouldn't allocate that to the low income customers. I mean, slightly higher rate for the other customers for the business plan to work out. But it's the way we've traditionally done things with universal service
Right,
and
and I
utilities.
think we did take some testimony on that, and
Good. And
I'm sure
there was some reluctance.
yes, there's, as I remember, they gave us a lecture or lesson in financial reality and how tight their financing is, but we will hear from them again. I'm sure this is just our first walkthrough of this subject.
And I'm sure their financing has gotten even tighter, but on the other hand, we never knew there would be these hundreds of millions if they ever show up.
But again,
Oh,
we're
federal
not sure
money.
if the federal money
Right,
can be used that way.
right, again, having been stimulus are used to that.
Yeah, I mean, you got the money for 6 months and then they say, oh, but you can't use it here. Oh, you could have used it here.
Right.
So,
It may depend who you ask on what that is.
Yeah.
How persistent
Yes,
you are.
it is dealing with Washington and,
So if we can just skip to the next slide. If we're providing, as the CAP agencies provide training, as we try to get people lined up with these subsidies, what are we saying are the minimum requirements? I can understand in the build out that you want to build out not for today's minimum requirements, but for tomorrow, and tomorrow's. I argue there's no such thing as really future proofing, but you want to go as far as you can go. But when we're talking about no capital outlay and getting people hooked up with something today, I think, as I said at the beginning, that bandwidth turns out not to be as important as 2 other characteristics that ISPs don't usually talk about, which are latency and jitter. So if you're on, and this is for teleconferences like this one, you remember I was testifying via Starlink a couple of years ago.
okay,
And sometimes, I remember, but you probably don't remember, sometimes I would freeze.
Yes.
And when
I
somebody
remember
has a
that.
poor
That's when
connection,
we
then
were
they're
still-
justifying.
Putting these things on barn roofs and sending it down the road.
Right, exactly. So latency is how long it actually takes a signal to get to you. And you say, well, but it's all going at the speed of light, but it's really not, because it's going through a bunch of routers and a bunch of buffers. And so the technology doesn't matter much, but different providers do a good or bad job at providing low latency, at getting the signal from one end to the other through all of the connections. And it's no guarantee, if you have fiber, you're gonna have enough bandwidth, but there isn't any guarantee that the latency will be good unless the ISP is skilled enough at making their connections to the rest of the internet. Another measure that goes along with that is something called jitter, that software like Zoom is good at trying to adapt itself to whatever the latency is, but if the latency is changing all the time, which is the technical word for it is jitter, then it doesn't do a good job. And again, you get freeze ups. So we do want to make sure that we're getting people service not only with adequate bandwidth, but also with adequate latency and with jitter. And I'd argue, as you think in the future about the standards for financing, we don't want to only have minimum standards for bandwidth, but also minimum standards for latency and jitter.
So thanks for helping us think more carefully and more detail. When we did the 100-100 symmetrical, that was sort of pushing ourselves along.
Yeah.
Where can we look for standards on latency and jitter, and how would you recommend we express them? Not just for now, but as you say, looking ahead for future needs and more enhanced uses. If we were to express it somewhere, what figures would you recommend?
Let's go to the next slide if we could. I mean, okay. So people who are concerned about internet quality are paying more and more attention to latency and jitter. This happens to be the thing that I wrote that I do away, but now if you do a speed test and you ask for more information, you can also often see the latency and the jitter. It's just that we're not trained to take advantage of that yet. Right today, you want the latency to be less than 75 milliseconds almost all of the time. And the jitter to be something less than 15 milliseconds in order for it to be good for conferencing. This has almost no effect on streaming because streaming gets buffered up. This is really important in conferencing, in anything that's live and interactive. And that's why it's got so much more attention since we've all been living
I
online.
think we've seen all the variations with delay and fade in and fade out and voices that are changing and.
Right. And feedback. And so
Yeah.
but these are the main two measures, and others perhaps will be developed. And certainly something the Public Service Department is aware of and needs to help with standards for.
And do those figures play into, I forget the terms from telephones, when you only one person could speak at a time versus two people could speak over each other. Sometimes I notice that our video links sort of fall into that mode where only one person can hear at a time or speak at a time.
Yeah, in the old days, telephone with technical word was simplex or half duplex. There's only one direction at a time. Radio is sort of like that when you say over and let the other person talk. And you're right, when the bandwidth is restricted, then it often acts as if it's one way. It's getting crowded out in one direction, even though technically the frequencies are different for the internet, but it does work that way.
Okay.
Also, if you have a voice over IP telephone, it's sensitive to latency and jitter.
Okay, I'm gonna ask that we move it along, because this is getting, I think, more technical than we
technical,
need to get.
This is the end for me, so I'm
Okay.
glad to answer any other questions. So again,
Okay,
thank you for bringing this topic up again, and I'm glad it's at the beginning of the session, and hope that you'll find a way to help with affordability and with the knowledge gap.
okay. Any questions for Mr. Ensler?
Good, thank you for having me.
Holly, you're next, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. I'm glad we agree on so much. I'm going to straighten out your sleeve.
I'm playing.
Oh,
Well,
you wanna keep you looking
All right,
good?
I do have the new agenda. You want it?
All right. Thanks, Jill.
Okay.
Appreciate it. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. And my husband says I'm flunking retirement, but I just want to make it clear that I'm here as a volunteer for an organization of volunteers. I am Holly Kroshner. You can go to the next slide, Jill. And I'm here as the chair of Equal Access to Broadband. And we developed this tiny nonprofit at the request of EC Fiber when they were having problems during the pandemic, not that it's over, but they couldn't figure out how to get those low-income households on their service without just handing out cash to whomever. So this organization was created to try to give some structure to that process. And it has blossomed into a service organization that is there to help. We recommend low-income households find service to whatever carrier they have access to. But we are working especially with the communication union districts. So I'm long in the tooth. I have a few years of experience, and most of it has been telecom oriented. I do have a number of current volunteer activities that are oriented towards telecom as well. Next slide, Jill, thanks. So why the heck am I here? Well, because Senator Cummings said, please come, and I do what she says. But
They all did.
I do want to make it clear that affordability is an issue in Vermont. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I'm not going to talk about latency one whit, because I need to figure out with you how to make sure that low-income households can access internet, because Tom and I agree, it is the road out of poverty. And we need to become more efficient and effective in making it available to everyone. So this little chart just shows you that, yes, we have a monthly service cost. This is a good thing to keep in mind. We have a monthly service cost. We also have to buy devices. But there's a thing that we don't talk about, and that's the cost to connect to the house or the home. And it is true that many households, we want to, if I do anything today, it is to help give you a framework to think about these issues, because we talk a lot about accessibility. But as Tom pointed out, accessibility usually is just measured whether the fiber or the broadband goes past where you're living. It has nothing to do about whether you can afford the service. And that word accessibility has become the hurdle to really understanding this problem. Next slide, please. So let's examine your assumptions about broadband, okay? More megabits are better. Well, not necessarily. There's an amount of megabits that are enough.
I think we've heard testimony in here in the past that the few, I think Franklin Telephone was one, and maybe even EC Fiber, when they offered a speed that the large majority of people went to the lower speed but less costly program. Yeah, I know Franklin was one.
Well, you know, this is a situation. There are folks who would like to work from home, and they should have the opportunity to access those higher speeds at a reasonable rate. For most of us, zooming back and forth, checking our Facebook or our email, a lower bandwidth, a smaller bandwidth is adequate. Always sold as I prefer what's called square, equal up and equal down bandwidth, so that it isn't just that the carrier can push more content advertising towards you, but rather you have the opportunity to go back and forth. I happen to have a daughter who's a PhD in material science. She's an engineer. She can't come home and stay with us and do her work because her work requires more bandwidth than I can buy from Topsham Telephone at a reasonable rate. So that's a comment about how many megabits. CUD rates are better. No, CUDs are trying to build to comparable rates. And that doesn't mean it's cheap. Rural service is not cheap, no matter what you do.
If it were cheap, the big companies would have done it already.
Exactly.
It's too expensive for them to do.
I'd also like us to think about whether we assume that the CUDs will meet low-income needs. The funding they're receiving for construction is an amount to fund the necessary build, and you've heard directly from them, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but let's just not assume that affordability here means that they can meet every household's needs. There's also this sort of general sense that if we just ever advertise the federal subsidy more people would be online. And those low-income households that qualify for the subsidy, they do it. But we're going to talk more about why that is not the case. It's also not the case that broadband carriers must provide an affordable rate, or that they must provide even access to the federal subsidy. This is a do-it-yourself subsidy system from A to Z. Social services agencies have not previously been in a position to help with broadband. I think we'll hear more about that in a little bit. And lastly, people use the web to register for low-cost service. They don't necessarily use the web because that's the point. Next slide, please, Jill. So many can't connect to a network right outside their doors. How frustrating that might be. I had this experience in 2021 when I went home from work and working to avoid COVID, and I had a little merger thing going on between public media stations. And I went to our local school principal and said, golly, I'm having problems with my broadband service. How are your students doing? She said, it is horrible. And there was every effort made to get equipment to them very inexpensively, but the bandwidth problem and the literal absence of access, absence of connection to their households was a big problem. So if we go to the website of the Department of Public Service, we'll find that they're reporting that 90% of the households have access to 25/3 service who are in the low income eligible category. That's because people who are in the low income household category may live in areas that have are more densely populated, and they have broadband going past where they live. They don't have access. And really, of those areas where 90% of the households have access to 25/3, which is our baseline broadband definition, 68% of them are living below the federal poverty level. You get the point. I don't need to belabor it, Jill. Yeah. It's that call the telephone number for telephone. Jill, can I have the next slide? Thanks. This is important to me in a much bigger way. There is a growing national gap in our society. These numbers come from, I've been working with a Chicago organization called the Benton Foundation. Their whole line of work is to try to figure out affordability and equal access to broadband, equitable access to broadband. So they recently did a study and said, so let's divide the country into households with $55,000 or more. And in Vermont, 52 for a household of 4 is the poverty limit. Okay. And the other category would be households with $25,000 or less. If we just made that baseline division, you'd find out that most of the households with over $55,000 have both cell service and broadband. That's the standard. Most of them, almost 100%, own a computer. And most of them believe that broadband is necessary for school, for public school. Why does that matter to me? There is something that the Pew Charitable Trust has been looking at, and the US Department of Education has researched. It says that when you're living in poverty, you do your darndest to convince yourself that you don't need another anything. And here we are. It's pretty clear that the rest of the country is having both broadband and cell service. And so we're finding that we're creating a culture where people are actively pushing back on having to afford broadband and or cell service. And it's, who's it affecting? Their kids, their opportunity, their way of connecting. They're in trouble. This is a number that comes from a group called the National Telephone Industry Association. 108,000, 41.3% of Vermont households are federal subsidy eligible for broadband. But most of those folks don't get help. Next slide, please, Jill. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about this federal subsidy program. I just want to make sure that you're aware of it. It's called the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP. Anybody who's talking about broadband right now is talking about ACP. And right now, that's a $30 a month benefit. You have to qualify for it. So there's 3 steps. You have to qualify for it. That means you have to go online to a portal. You have to upload your evidence of poverty. That's usually your free and reduced lunch
By the time
letter.
you get to upload, I get panicky.
And so do they. Then, once you have qualified, then you have to go further into the process and apply for the benefit. Then that application in a federally administered system issues you a number. And you have a registration number that then you can provide to your broadband carrier. And they have to go into the system and enter that number and say, this person now receives service from us, so we want the $30 a month subsidy to pay for their service.
All of this is for $30 a month.
Yes, ma'am.
I can see a cost benefit going on here.
It's worse than you know. Next slide, please. So we were just part of a national presentation on this program. And, bottom line, enrollment can be really hard. Yes, Mr. Epstein is right. People just don't know about this program. And so much of the federal money right now through the FCC is just being pushed out towards agencies and others to say, look at this website. That's just not
That'll
enough.
tell you how to get hooked up to it.
Exactly. If you're in a low income household, there is a tremendous amount of distrust already about programs and registrations and telling the federal government whatever. So there is a trust barrier. There's application challenges. Every computer system comes with glitches, but this time we get a federally hired vendor who's implementing this process, and their offices don't agree on what the eligibility requirements look like. Our organization has had to go to bat for individuals whose free and reduced lunch program letter didn't meet some criterion. And so we have to go in and advocate for it. No, it says right here. And those households aren't often equipped to do that work. And then, so nationally, 1 in 3 eligible households are participating. The Benton Foundation recently did some research and said that Vermont is not among those states that is doing very well here. Why? Because urban areas are doing better and communities of color are doing better. Imagine, how is that working? Well, it just so happens that there's community centers and folks can go down to the community center, or there's an organization, a couple of them in the United States, of Black churches who sit out in the parking lot and register people for broadband as part of their community service. How awesome is that? But rural communities, not so much. People who have to travel a distance to sit at a table with someone, not so much. People who would have to zoom in order to talk about broadband subsidies, not so much.
How do you zoom in if you don't have broadband?
Next slide, please, Jill. So remember those 108,000 eligible households? Up until October, and this comes from Clay Purvis at NTIA.
That's right, Clay's got a new title.
He has a new job and we're so grateful. 15,802 eligible Vermonters applied for the HCP through October of 2022. And how many of those folks actually received service? About half. What is happening in between? Well, it's about the fact that the ACP is voluntarily run by ISPs, by the internet service providers. It's about the fact that, well, I might have gotten all the way through that process and then there's no drop to my house. And I can't afford the $400,000, $500,000 drop. You know, if you're in a mobile home, prefabricated home, the National Electric Code requires that your drop needs to be in conduit. We have been trying to work on that. That's like a $1,500 minimum cost to bring service to that place. Very difficult. So there's barriers on the side of the ISPs. All this work for $30 a month. Who can afford that? Well, Comcast can. Now, I don't work for Comcast, so I can't speak for them. But once you have enough lines strung and enough revenue building up, it seems to me that you can be additive for $30 a month, and it's a contained cost for marginal additional revenue. It is true, however, that Comcast even has been cited by the FCC for putting conditions on even participating in their low-income program that weren't meetable by low-income households. And when they start with, you can't ever have had an unpaid bill with us. Next slide, please. That is old information from 2 years ago, so I'm sure they fixed it. So our feeling is that folks really need personal support to access the internet. I'm sorry, there's some things we just can't do online effectively. And that's why we started working with ISPs to give people access to this program. Next slide, please. So what did we do? Equal Access created what we call the bridge. We're trying to bridge from a commercial system called broadband to a social services environment called low-income households. Yes, we have addressed the capstone agencies and asked that we collaborate with them, because the biggest barrier here is that we don't know who those low-income households are. We have to wait for them to reach out to us. So what do we spend the majority of our budget doing? Knock, knock, knock. Going to schools, going to the capstone agencies, going to other social services agencies, going to libraries, going to the CUDs. We are trying so hard to be respectful, to treat private information appropriately, and yet have the information get out into the public. And so far, all of this work has been funded on the backs of EC Fiber to a tune over 2 years of about $200,000. We have one employee and a contractor. In that time, we have created a process for engagement. We call it a campaign. How do you get out and communicate to your public that this opportunity is there? We've created a data tool for registration. How do we keep the caller's information on file so that we can help them incrementally through the process? We have formalized broadband navigator training to help our staff help the caller, because this is the problem. If you call the ISP's offices, most of them would say, I have 12 minutes to make this sale. And you're talking to me about what? And we spend approximately 68 minutes per customer to get folks registered. That just doesn't work in a commercial environment. We have been working with EC Fiber to increase what we call the gap subsidy. The lowest rate at EC Fiber is $72 a month. That's a nice hefty width of broadband, and it's a very generous offering. It's just that the expendable income available in most low-income households, according to Capstone agencies, is about $20 to $22 a month. So they're not going to make it to 72, and even with the ACP, they're only at 52. So what do they do to make that last 20 bucks? We're not talking about the drop to the house, and we're not talking about buying a laptop. We're just talking about the monthly service. How did they get there? EC Fiber has been funding a program for us to reimburse them for affordable broadband, gap subsidies, $20 a month per ACP qualified household. And then our goal is to minimize the cost of this program by sharing it out through all the CEDs. Why the CEDs? Because they're mission driven to serve everyone in the community. Next slide, Jill. Thanks. This is just what it takes to get somebody connected to the internet using the ACP. We have to talk back and forth. The ACP has this interesting little glitch.
Talk
Yeah, we actually talk to them.
to a human.
To humans, yeah, human to human.
That, okay,
And we have
that's good.
we have reporting mechanisms. It's scalable, but the fact of the matter is, here's a fun fact to know and tell. Once we get an individual household qualified and applied through the ACP system, that internet provider has 90 days to pick up that registration number and provide that household service, or we start at square one again. 90 days, it's built into the legislation.
That takes quite a bit of a chunk out of going to school online.
Yes, and think about it from the ISP's point of view. What can be their incentive when they've got crew scheduling to do? They have to set up their billing system. They have to get it all synced. They have to go out and make that federal application to serve that customer with that number. And it's all got to come together in 90 days. Now think about it if you're a CUD building a new network. OMG. Really hard. Next slide, please. To me, the CUD difference is that every household counts. It's a municipal entity, but they're trying to build a network, and they're not subsidized for free drops to low-income households. And they don't have any revenue for a gap subsidy. EC Fiber's been doing this for 7-8 years. They have a lot of customers. They've got some revenue coming in. Those CUDs, I know that $1 is going to be blessed as it crosses the threshold, but it's already spent. And this is actually, it's not year 2 of deployment. This is more like year 1 of deployment, because year 1 was spent getting the BCBB set up and the grants out the door.
Right.
Right. Next slide, please.
And the cable lined up.
Yeah. So I just wanted to share that, notwithstanding all the gloom and doom, when you get that low income household connected, boy, are they pleased. And it's a joyous day. One of my favorite little examples, Ken Caddow, Rebecca Holcomb's on our board, a guy named Peter Drescher, whom you might know. Ken Caddow tells a story. He was working at Randolph High School, and he had a conference call scheduled with one of his students during COVID. And he saw in the FaceTime that there was a roof line behind this kid. Where are you? I'm on the shed of the barn. How'd you get up there? Well, I just climb from my house over across the roof, and then it's the only place I can get service is on my phone on the roof. And that kid, when his household was able to get connected to EC Fiber, that kid dug the line himself to get that fiber service to his household. And we got his household connected to the ACP. Next slide, please, Jill. So I don't know, you must be thinking about what would help Vermonters. So are we. Drop funding. It's a biggie. Your question about what can the federal funding be used for? Yes, it can be used for drop funding.
The infrastructure money that's coming.
The infrastructure money that's coming in can be used for drop funding, but it won't be here, won't be until 2025. Okay, just to be clear.
Okay.
There is a need for this GAP subsidy. There is no federal funding coming for GAP subsidies. Zip. The GAP subsidy is the ACP. And by the way, the ACP is up for reappropriation by Congress in 2024. Help me. Let's stay in touch with Senator Welch.
I heard he was in the building.
He is in the building.
Mhm.
That's going to be so very important.
Yeah.
And increasing it would be
Yeah, I
better
was
than
gonna say,
decreasing
because
it.
that's, you've still got at least the $50 gap in there.
Do you know average broadband cost in Europe is closer to $25 a month?
Yeah, I know, but we know what their income tax rate is.
There you go. Average broadband cost in urban areas is closer to $30 a month. Out here, in talking to CUDs anyway, the range is, 60 to 75. And I would encourage this body to consider whether there needs to be authority given either to the VCBB or the department or somehow to do an affordable rate reporting mechanism every year for everybody. That's not regulating ISPs. Affordable rate reporting. What is the range of rates? And make that available to consumers through an independent third body, because we don't have that kind of information today. I can also say that the biggest barrier to our serving more households is the outreach data. And this, when we talked to the capstone agencies 2 years ago, they said, yeah, I'm happy to help, really interesting idea. 2 problems. We don't do broadband very well. And we don't have any money to have a person to help you do what you do. We hardly had any money ourselves. So I would love to think that we could shortcut their work by using an existing system. But if it takes funding for them to help us identify who's needing or get the word out, I'm all for it. But that would be my fourth point. I would love to see you put $300,000 in a line item somewhere for 23, 24, or 25 funding for equal access to broadband. Because while we may or may not get funding through the BEAD program, we are living hand to mouth, funded by one small CUD for the benefit of the state.
Okay. So this would be for your program?
We're the only ones doing what we do,
Access to
equal access to broadband.
equal access. Have you talked to the appropriations committee?
I haven't, because, until you invited me in, I was busy trying to figure out how to get more people through our program.
Oh, that. Yeah. And the people that have to go, I mean, I just know how frustrated I get trying to do things on the internet. And yeah, you push a button and you're back where you started again. And if you're a low income parent with a bunch of kids who are, yeah,
The same.
yeah, you're worried about food and you're worried about,
Our big problem is we have a hard time sustaining a phone call with that person long enough to get them actually registered. Because, this kid, that kid, battery's gone, they don't have enough time on their cell phone, which is a pay-as-you-go program.
yeah.
It's challenging. And Jill, you can finish that up, please. That's all I have for you. Certainly, if you have questions, I'd love to do anything I can to help you.
Other than money, how would we get the providers to do a better job in the areas that are financial losers? If this were the 1930s and this was electricity,
Right, I
it
know.
was very simple. You want the profits from selling your electricity downtown, run the lines out to the farm at the end of the road. We know it's a loser. Sorry. That's the deal. Take it or leave it. We can't do that.
So that's why I just think that transparency is a pretty powerful tool. It's maybe the only tool we have. And so affordable rates being published, what are the rate ranges of all the carriers? And then there is this program, ACP, is being tracked by the NTIA. And they have published how many people in Vermont are taking this program. And I think it's just worth noting that if you started tracking that a bit more publicly, whether it's done through the Department of Public Service or the VCBB. I know the VCBB is very interested in affordability issues and plans to, I'm hopeful that they will take this on as publicly, but I'm an old telecom lawyer, and yeah, they're pretty serious about that don't regulate us thing.
Yeah, they are.
Public utility is not a bad model.
It's not a bad.
Just one more thing, and this is more of a comment thing. One problem you mentioned was you had to picture the old lady
Yeah.
looking really frustrated and all that. My sense is that the problem a lot of people have just working with computers is not that they're curmudgeonly, it's that the instructions actually do not instruct. And that I think the people who program computers are brilliant at what they're brilliant at, which is computers. I think they're really inept at using the English language in a coherent, expository way.
So, so I used to sit on the governing board of EC Fiber. And I remember what drove me to this work. And it was a meeting, and they're all about talking about, what's our ARPU, where's our next household, how many drops are we gonna do next month, and all that stuff. So much jargon. And the fact of the matter is that this human problem doesn't lend itself to that environment very well. So you're absolutely right. And I'm not trying to suggest that anyone over the age of 40 is not computer literate, but there is both digital literacy problems and affordability problems.
Well, there are, I would direct anyone who's interested. There's a service called Westlaw.
Yep.
That lawyers use.
Yep.
It is laid out logically and the instructions are clear in English. And the other is, I hate to say it, the state of New Hampshire. I hate to say it, but they play 20 questions. They keep dividing the universe in half.
That's it. You get 3 questions, 3 choices as to what is your problem. It's none of these. Yeah.
Well, I will say this, the state of New Hampshire is doing worse at getting people ACP than we are.
That's old information, actually, when I said this, but I'll tell you, when I was teaching, I would say to my students, do any of you click on help? And they laugh out loud. And one young girl just said, they always guess wrong. They think they know what I'm gonna ask, and they're wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
Senator from Hinsdale.
This could also maybe be touched on by our next witness too, but for a while, the EPA had a program called Cool and Connected, and it would combine efforts in energy impoverished areas and heat islands to get heat pumps and energy implements as well as broadband to people at the same time, recognizing that those were similar consumers. And I always thought it was such a great idea, so maybe I'm saying it also to my CV here. But there's like combining forces and using the workforce power you have and the ability to go out and sort of evangelize about both and try to get people help, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, 2 years ago, when Mr. and Mrs. Epsland were helping support an idea about a limited period program with a sizable budget, that was one of the ideas, is take the Capstone agencies who are already in the home and have them talk to folks about their drop. The problem is those agencies don't do the drop. The companies do. And so then you have that same communication issue again, but it doesn't help you with the affordability of the service, but in terms of making people aware, getting the word out, all that stuff. I agree. Anything we can do to make the information more available through a trusted source, that element of trust.
Yeah, and that's a big thing.
Someone asked what would you have done in the 1930s. In the 1930s, it would have been the agricultural county agent who would have done kitchen coffee meetings, which is, back then was probably to help them learn how to hook up for electricity, but that's what it would have taken.
It's interesting that people don't talk about the fact that back in the 1930s, when we were doing this power distribution, the existing power companies weren't exactly helpful in that process. And now the leverage of those existing companies has landed us with a federal subsidy program that looks like this. Do it yourself, terminates in 90 days, voluntarily produced by the ISP.
It's like we used to ask the electric companies to promote conserving and not using electric energy. I mean,
That worked well.
that worked.
And yet I will say 15 million Americans have found their way to this program, and it does exist. So I don't want to be completely ungrateful to Congress for figuring this much out.
It is something. The amount probably needs to be updated to present
Or
reality.
allocated towards rural communities.
Yeah, and, but our challenge right now, unless we can come up with a whole lot of money, which isn't likely, is how do we, because what you've been attempting to do is that model, have somebody trusted, which is probably somebody from Capstone that's already helped you figure out how to pay your rent, not get evicted, and how to access food and 100 other things. How do we get them the training or the personnel that they need
We can train them.
Yeah,
We can train them or they can refer to us. It's pretty
so
straightforward.
it's how we set that up. And we got NECA coming on next.
Yay.
They can help us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, one more.
And two others, when microwave ovens came out, county agents did kitchen, get your neighbors together and teach you how to do it. And in the seventies, literacy was done in groups in kitchens where people were home and had the time to get together and learn how to read.
Vermont's great at collaboration. And, you know, we're lucky to live here. And the CUDs are so interested in getting to the point where they can do this kind of collaboration. It's just that they need the cash flow to support it. That's what I am asking them for support and they're really having a hard time. And they need the money for the drops. If they can't, you know, they can't say, well, we can't afford to build out this year because we passed this group of low-income households and we have to get these new drops. That's
Yeah, no, and basically, we've given them some money to help them get a few customers so they can go to Wall Street and get the rest of the money they need. And they were very clear with this last year that they are so leveraged. They're just not gonna have the bandwidth, no pun included, to be able to, you know, offer $30 a month, which for some households would be a stretch anyway. And now with inflation and the increased cost of everything, they're gonna have even less. Okay,
Thanks very much.
thank you, thank you for all of you. You've been hanging in there.
Good to see you.
Hopefully we can show you a lifeline and at least know you're being heard.
Thank you.
It is the next step in, and the important one.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, although we can't pay people for that.
No,
Thank you.
nobody
Thank you.
can. Okay, so we have Casey Richardson from NECA, Northeast Kingdom Community Action, right?
Yes. Thank you
Okay,
so
can you
much.
hear us? We can see you.
Can you hear me?
You're a little soft.
Okay.
Wait, Jill's turning you up. Okay, try again.
Better now?
That's better, yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction. I am Casey Winterson. Thank you so much for your time and the opportunity to speak today. So I am the Director of Economic and Community-Based Services at Northeast Kingdom Community Action, which is the lead community action agency for Caledonia, Essex, and Orleans counties. In all of my extra spare time, I also sit as a core team member for the Digital Equity Planning Grant, which is being led by Vermont Community Broadband Board. And I sit there as a representative for the 5 CAP agencies, the community action agencies across the entire state. Lastly, I'm a resident of Vermont. I care deeply about my neighbors, my community, and our state as an entire, which is why I was really excited to be invited today. So as you all know, internet is definitely the backbone of today's world. It powers all aspects of our modern lives. You know, it gives us access to education, economy, healthcare, as well as allows us to be socially well, connecting with family, friends, etc. In the state, around 95% of Vermonters do have access to some type of broadband that is providing at least 1 megabit per second worth of downloading service. So to put that into perspective, 1 megabit is about enough power to do some emailing and some light internet browsing. But if you're trying to go home after a long day of sitting in work and trying to go on to watch your Netflix TV show, you're probably not going to have enough power to get that download. Or if you do, it's going to be really patchy. So while 95% of the folks in our state do have access, about 1 out of every 10 of those individuals don't actually have access to a plan that provides more than 25 megabits per second. Nationally, we're looking at about 109 being the average, which in one of the research studies I was just reading about puts Vermont at the bottom 5 for states in our overall average. So kind of taking the turn and spinning towards the actual affordability, it means, personally, I think it means something different for every person, every place in the state. In our urban areas, affordability means getting assistance in driving down the prices of broadband, allowing subsidies to have folks enter the market, as well as protecting folks from being held hostage by the price gouging that exists within the structure that's already created. And then on the flip side, you have rural areas. And for folks like me, it's a little bit different than that. For me, it means having some sort of access to broadband so that I don't have to run out in one of those crazy Vermont snowstorms we get and clean off the satellite dish because my internet went down, which is the case for a lot of folks in the Northeast Kingdom. I do live right off of one of the main routes, one of the main feeding servers for internet. However, they won't come up the side streets, and I only live probably 300 yards off of the main road. So there's affordability is kind of it looks at different pieces. It's not just the actual getting the internet affordable, but it's also like just getting the internet to the folks so that we can build a population of folks that can get actually onto the internet and have that service. I really do think broadband affordability starts before the consumer. Due to the ruralness of our state, it's considered a high cost and underserved area. And basically that means that the building of the broadband service is too high for a lot of those big groups to move in, which is what we see kind of happening now with the CUDs and having them be this provider rather than someone like Comcast or Spectrum or whomever it may be. And a lot of that has to do with the location, the remoteness, the population density, the topography of the state, as well as the high rates of poverty that exist, especially in rural areas. It's not advantageous for those big companies to move in. And as a result of that, what happens is we end up getting faced with this competition between providers where one provider is charging a high amount and the other provider is charging a little bit lower, but the service is a little bit different. And it basically turns to just the consumer being the one that's paying. And it just drives up those costs. And what we see I would say most of the time within the CAP agencies is we have folks that are coming in and just sitting in our lobbies so that they can use internet, or they may be sitting in a coffee shop so they can use internet because they can't afford it when they're in their own homes. And a lot of that has to do with just the barrier that exists to get into that market itself. Vermonters need help. Obviously, we need help getting access to reliable broadband services across the state, and that specifically in a way that the consumer won't be the one that's faced with the high cost once they do get that access. What we're seeing with the CUDs is it's really great that there's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of money being dumped into the system. However, when they go to start up and fire up those homes, they're paying a pretty premium price just to get into it to help drive down what the costs are to get all of that situated and get those people connected. Similarly, low-income Vermonters need help gaining equitable access, which is a big discussion right now. And to jump back a little bit to the ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program, NECA leading the 5 CAP agencies actually did apply for the grant that came from the FCC. It was due, I don't know, a month and a half ago or so. I was part of the team that wrote the request for proposal for that grant, and we're hoping that we will be able to get the funding that's necessary to do that work. But unfortunately, it is a piece of the puzzle is that CAP agencies, we're currently shackled with a lot of things that are happening, a lot of programs that we're trying to stand up, and we only have so many dollars to stretch to so many staff. So the big challenge. Yep.
what did you apply for a grant to do?
So the ACP grant is to do outreach as well as application
Okay.
assistance.
All right. So there is a grant out there. All right,
There is, yes. So in its entirety, it was a lot of money. It's a lot of money for the whole program. There was a state cap around, it was $1 million. And for the 5 cap agencies, we wrote the grant and came in at around $630-ish thousand for 2 years, which would provide application assistance and employees for said application assistance. The problem is that many of the cap agencies are only able to employ a 20-hour person based on the funding that we got. When in reality, things like these types of programs really do need a full-time person. If we were to kind of hold the candle up to how the Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance, the VRAP program went, cap agencies had multiple staff that were working on that, and that still wasn't enough. So funding for cap agencies is always, I feel it's always something that we're asking for, but at the same time, one of the biggest challenges that we have is that we can do the work, we just don't have the ability with the staff, the staffing that we do have. Furthermore, I think with the conversation that was happening around the line drops, there are programs that exist out that are already out there that, that Vermont utilizes, like the Housing Opportunity Grant, the HOP program, where they provide dollars to cap agencies that we can administer out for things like rental assistance or something along those lines. And I think that that could be a mechanism that might be able to be utilized, where cap agencies can be the guardians of those dollars and help folks that are low income, that meet our program requirements, come in, they apply, they go through the same process as they would for a food shelf assist or for access to the Head Start or the parent-child centers that we have. They could come in, apply, go through that process and get awarded those dollars so that the cap agency could be the one cutting the checks for that drop.
but that would have to be state funding.
That would have to be state funded, yes. Unless there were federal dollars, I'm not entirely sure what those federal dollars, how that would work, but if the money was there, we have the mechanism to be able to do that, and we have the we have that connection point to those low income Vermonters, and we also all specialize in our areas. So NECA, for instance, Northeast Kingdom, we're much different than CVOEO out in Burlington. The population that we serve, what that population diversity makeup looks like. So in what I think would be great would be entrusting the cap agencies with those dollars so that they can serve their communities, which are the communities they know. And yeah, and I can't say I know anything. Yeah, the latency and the jitter stuff, I honestly don't know very much about. I just know when I connect to the computer, it turns the internet and there I go away surfing the web. But for the actual services piece, that is something that cap agencies, myself included, have the experience, have done for many years and could continue to do so that we can get Vermonters connected and get access to that. And another point around the $30 stipend. So ACP, it is that $30 stipend. And it is true that that's not enough, but that's the best that we can do given the funding that we have. There is a disconnect between the $30 that it costs or that you're getting and the $75 to $100 that it costs to have internet in the Northeast Kingdom, to have good internet that's reliable. So there is a disconnect there, and it would be wonderful to have some sort of program that could help close that gap. But I think just in and of itself, having access to that program in the Northeast Kingdom across the state would allow for more folks to get connected, would drive those numbers up for the ACP, would show federally that we need more dollars for this because it is a need. And like I said, it could get Vermont connected to the rest of the world. It could get, it would allow a lot of folks who need that who need that access to do schooling, to go to work, to find a job, to apply for programming, whatever it may be. It really is a barrier when they don't have that access. And that's something that we see all the time. Like I said, we have folks that come into our center just to use our internet. We do have outreach workers that are working on this right now without any sort of funding, but it's difficult when they're also taking things in for crisis fuel, housing assistance, dealing with folks that are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. So the hope is that we'll get this funding, we'll be bringing on new staff, and we'll be able to really direct more eyes and power to it. But we would love any sort of additional funding to really bolster up that staffing and provide Vermonters with the internet that they need and deserve.
Okay. 7.
I have a question that's a little bit of an aside, but I think in people's desperation to get the connectivity in the kingdom, I have some friends and people I know who tried Starlink. And it's been maybe like other things that Elon Musk does, just disappointing. It's left people with very inaccessible service and, unable to sort of get what they need when something breaks down or they have a need for help. And I just feel badly like there's like a consumer protection issue involved. I don't know if you're hearing reports about that. People have put a lot of money into trying to get that connectivity and are now kind of stuck with this system.
Yeah, it's a problem that I personally have faced. Starlink is great. It provides internet, but it is that problem of breaking down. It does have issues, but similarly on not just that, the buy-in to the Starlink program is astronomical. You're talking about, you don't have to worry about the drop in that case, but what you do have to worry about is the $1,000 some odd it costs just to get the startup equipment. And then I believe it's like $110, $15 a month, which is rather high for a program like that. And it still is new in technology. So in the realm of, technology, we've had the satellite around for a long time, but this low satellite that Starlink operates at is much different. So we don't have a lot of folks coming in with those types of problems. I don't think that they would come to us for those types of problems anyway, because 9 times out of 10, the folks that we're serving are not even eligible to get into that market. And that's the big thing for the CAP agencies is that there's just a very large barrier to entry for internet and broadband. And that only becomes more of a challenge. It becomes more of a challenge when you're in a rural place like the Northeast Kingdom, where right before joining this, I was actually speaking with one of my colleagues. She lives 3 miles out of St. Johnsbury, which would be probably the most populated, is the most populated part of the Northeast Kingdom. She lives 3 miles out and doesn't have access to broadband other than through like a satellite, which provides 5 megabits of download and I think like 1.5 upload. And you're talking about St. Johnsbury, Vermont, which, how is that a possibility? So I think the first.
You 3 miles from this Gold Dome, you can find the same situation.
Oh yeah, I lived right on Route 2 in East Montpelier before moving to the Kingdom. We had one provider, it was Comcast, but outside of that, you're paying $125 a month for internet and you don't have any other options. So there are multiple things that are a challenge for the Kingdom, which is who I'm speaking necessarily for right now. Our biggest challenge is we just don't have access, and I know that that's coming, and that's exciting for us. I can't tell you the excitement that folks feel when they see that little consolidated truck heading up their dirt road. It's like a kid on Christmas morning, I guess, is the best way that I could compare that. But once we have access, I think the major piece is setting up some sort of ability for these CUDs to have low income programs, which would obviously require funding for those types of things. And similarly, having folks, allowing this to kind of go into the realm of public service, and having CAP agencies maybe pick that up with some proper funding to be able to administer these types of programs, similar to the different benefits that folks currently receive coming from either the state or from the CAP agency assistance.
Chris, when we talk about drops, if I own a home, I've got a mortgage, but it's mine, I can see where I might want to think about a drop as an investment. But if I'm renting, that, you know, and I don't have security that that rent might, you know, I might be able to stay there. Do you, are most of, yeah, what's your breakout for home ownership? And that can be, you know, double, single, wide, but an actual home versus renting. And do you see, because we've got, first we got to get the drop somewhere. And then you've got to have the equipment to use it. And then you've got to be able to afford the monthly service. And what are you seeing in the realm of drops? Is that, do we need something different for landlords? Are most of your people poor, but perhaps living in fairly poor housing? I've done some driving up through your area, and there's a lot of pretty sketchy housing.
There's definitely, poverty definitely plays a role into this for sure. I think that a lot of the housing that we have in the kingdom, you know, if it's the typical housing, the lower income housing properties, whether that be Rural Edges property, which is our housing developer up in the kingdom, I would say 9 times out of 10 they're probably already connected building wide. The standalone, I would say the standalone single family homes that are out in the woods somewhere would be a good, that's a great question. I can't honestly say I know the answer of what the drops would look like, but we serve across, you know, we serve homeowners and we also serve folks that are renting. I think that there could be an initiative for funding for landlords to be able to get their buildings connected. I think that if there was the ability for those drops to be paid for, whether that's through some sort of federal or state funding, if you look at how the Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program went, we had a lot of landlords that reached out for that funding on behalf of the folks that lived in their apartments. So I don't see it being a barrier if it's a rental versus a single family or an unowned home. It's also, you know, the drops are not always, the drops to going underground through conduit, those are the ones that are going to cost more money. There are houses that they'll just link from the pole to the house, and it's part of the whole service package. That does happen. So that could still be a possibility, but I think having the funding for those ones where it does have to go underground or it does have to be paid for, whether it be for the landlord or for the tenant, you know, it would make sense to me that it'd be a homeowner type of program, so that a homeowner could do that, or the landlord being the homeowner could do that on behalf of the tenants. Because once one is ran, everyone in that building could connect.
Okay. I'm trying to remember. This came up last year. I know there was a movement for libraries and apartment buildings, and I don't know that it made any headway last year, but I'll have to talk to our drafter and see what we did do. But I think most of these proposals, I know we did get them to make sure libraries got hookups and housing projects got hookups. But you get out into rural housing, that can be a long hookup.
Yes, rural housing is definitely the most difficult. And it is something that we, that we deal with all the time here in the Northeast Kingdom. It's also similar down in the southern part of the state. There's pockets of rural housing throughout our state. But places like Essex County, I'm actually up in Canaan today, which is why I'm joining you via Zoom. Places like Canaan, part of the, some of the most remote places in the state, they're often forgotten. And that can be an issue for connection, because the closest place to here is either New Hampshire, across the border, across the river, or you're driving to Newport, which is 35 minutes away. So just the idea of having a connection for folks that runs into Canaan, that runs to that person's house, so they can connect with their doctor or connect with somebody that's 35 minutes away, would be a huge win for communities like Canaan and the smaller communities that are more rural across the state.
Okay, any other questions? All right. Thank you. Stay in touch. If you think of anything, this is probably going to be as challenging as setting up the CUDs. But we'll have to see what we can figure out. All right. Committee. Mr. Whitaker, you're our last witness.
Ready?
Yep. The topic is making it affordable for lower income people to hook up.
Thank you, Stephen Whitaker, for the record. The purpose of my testimony is to both raise alarms and highlight opportunities implicating affordability. Do we attempt to brand the word affordability onto a dozen wild horses after they've escaped the barn? Or do we tune our planning strategy to accomplish affordability by design? There's no contingency plan nor safety net if we blow these hundreds of millions of dollars. This is truly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This is also the responsibility of this committee in particular, with jurisdiction over revenue, the PUC, and telecommunications. You are the legislative policymakers. You, with good information, must make sure this works. You recall, much to your chagrin, that I've served you up many problems and criticisms of dysfunction over the years and decades, but not today. So now we have this knowledge and information. This is the time for you to demonstrate vision, resolve, and accountability to Vermonters. I do appreciate the intent of the largely volunteer-driven efforts of the CUDs, their local knowledge and the needs of rural Vermont, and the appropriate routes to cover the large number of unserved residents provides a good starting point for our federally funded fiber build-out, but not enough. Unfortunately, we will clearly not have enough money to complete all of the CUD's networks. And not having enough money is already leading to some significant gaps, not just in reaching the last mile addresses, but more importantly in building resilience and ensuring that all of the demands and capabilities of a statewide fiber backbone are being adequately addressed. This must include transparency, and I was happy to hear your prior witness, Holly Groschner, speak to transparency, even if the broadband board and the CUDs are a poor example of it right now. Transparency will have to pick up another day, because I'm going to keep this positive. This must include transparency of planning, as these are public funds and our statute requires it. That's 30 VSA 202C and 202D, which also require competition, competitive choice. So how should we integrate critical public safety dispatching, essential radio links to towers, to the chronic need for ubiquitous cellular service, and electric utilities' need for communications, reliable communications from each substation, each electric meter, hydro and wind generation, and eventually every large and small battery storage, including every electric vehicle. That's the design that we're hinging our climate strategy on, is a integrated smart grid that uses all these storages to shave peak load. So I'm going off script here for a second to point out that integrated design here is the solution to affordability, is the only solution to affordability, because we are going to spend money double, triple, 4 times and still not have a functioning system if we don't do it. Only internet service is preempted from state regulation. The design, resiliency, and cost-effective economics of telecommunications transport over fiber can and should be thoroughly regulated by the PUC, with an attorney general hired independent public advocates being a necessity, at least for now. I think you understand what I'm saying there, but keeping it positive, I will not elaborate on another day. We should all be seriously concerned that before the federal money runs out, the CUDs will not be able to maintain viable businesses or provide the necessary service to all their customers. It is a much different skill to locate poles or design a fiber system than it is to provide a full suite of customer service, billing, tech support, and system maintenance. I think we all recognize that there will be consolidation of ownership in these different systems. This likely will mean public assets being transferred to private corporations. But these networks are not being built to utility grade. So if we transfer them to an electric utility so that they can use it for smart grid, and we've only built it to consumer grade, it's not gonna accomplish the broader goal. For all these reasons, there's a need today to implement a comprehensive engineered fiber design with a supporting econometric model. The economics of this can and have been modeled in other places like Huntsville, Alabama, and various other places. There is expertise on doing integrated fiber design with the backup economics. We are not pursuing it that way. I'm trying to go gentle here because we have a community broadband board member in the room. That includes the needs of each telecommunications user group and lays out the most cost-effective path. Electric utilities needs are not the same as those of consumer internet, nor are the cell carriers' needs the same as those of public safety, emergency radio, and telephone. What they all have in common is the need for affordable statewide connectivity that provides sustainable, resilient, utility grade, and in some cases, public safety grade service for all Vermonters. This has been true for nearly 25 years. Velco, of which VLIGHT, which is the Vermont Low Income Trust for Electricity, the 2 large electric co-ops, Washington Electric and Vermont Electric, and the municipally owned distribution utilities together have a controlling interest. I believe it's 51% control over the high capacity fiber backbones that Velco has built around Vermont. We should exercise both scrutiny and utilization of that. Velco has in prior years reported that they've invested some 100 million in the fiber network, only a fraction of which capacity is yet utilized. That same magic fiber technology, simply using faster pulses of light on more colors over the same strand of glass with upgraded electronics, is capable of 40 to 80 times the current capacity with the same core network electronics. 800 gigabit per second transport over 40 colors simultaneously over the same glass is possible in shipping today. From Sienna, the same vendor that Velco used around the state. We need Joint Fiscal Office to examine the revenue and revenue potential of this fiber network, both in avoiding the cost of duplicative expenses by the CUDs, in enhancing resilience and for needed revenue from commercial interests like cell carriers and internet giants. Policymakers need to question why we're told that 80% of the revenue from the excess fiber capacity will no longer accrue to the benefit of Vermont, but will be redirected elsewhere. It's mostly our fiber owned by Vermont ratepayers and controlled through VLIGHT, all Vermonters. We, as you well know, have huge demand for revenue to fund social benefit priorities such as childcare, paid family leave, 911 and regional dispatching, public media, and healthcare. We should immediately investigate the costs and benefits of Vermont owning the remaining 49% or controlling the remaining 49% of that fiber network and building off of that, retaining all of the revenues, excess revenues. There are delicate complications to that because the control is regulated by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, in support of ISO New England. So it is a regional grid, but as long as Velco is operating it to the same degree and supervision as currently, we could use and should use more of that capacity. This is not a new idea. The concept of outright ownership of Velco dates back to Governor Salmon's terms, and more recently is Senator Aluzzi's effort when he was committee chair and CDPS and Green Mountain Power were being merged. and sold.
I was on that committee.
So sound policymaking, strict adherence to statute, real integrated planning, and effective engaged oversight are needed now more than ever as this opportunity comes with a no do-over option. Oversight no longer can be considered an oversight in Vermont. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. The only thing I could find in Huntsville, Alabama was Huntsville Internet Service Neighbor.
What I have some backup material I can provide on that.
Just send it to Jill. I'm just wondering who I checked out for what.
Well, I don't think that, what happened there is the electric utility was building fiber and the
Okay,
collaboration between the internet, the municipal internet and the electric utility resulted in an integrated design with an economic model behind it.
okay.
That was done,
So,
that work was done by the broadband group out of Las Vegas. And
okay, so this is back to we should use the Velco, our electric lines should be coordinated and we should use the Velco lines.
Velco is transmission and that's the
Yes.
big rings.
Yeah.
What I would, the simplest description I can have is that every piece of CUD equipment purchased should be compatible with the Velco management software suite and triangulate to 2 of the Velco sites. Because that will in effect turn those Velco rings into a mesh network, which is the most reliable and resilient possibility for Vermont. Especially being able to, in a hurricane situation, having to very rapidly route around one fiber break, another fiber break, another fiber break. You can keep routing around those through a mesh and keep essential public safety communications and cell towers up.
Okay.
So I'm going to provide a copy here of a document that I provided to this committee 4 years ago, 3 years ago, or 4 years ago. And the last page of it is the location of the Velco multiplexers and their rings. And on the very back is the Velco fiber infrastructure. But I believe what's happening, because the governor appointed a Velco rep to the broadband board, Velco is cherry picking the secret contracts they want to provide and basically saying, this is our network. This is not the CUD's or the broadband board's network. They will allow pieces and spans to be used, but overall, we should be building to the same resiliency and increasing the density, the rural dispersion of that vast capacity deeper and deeper into the rural areas and generating revenue from it. The question is, who does the revenue go to? If Velco takes it and then gives 80% of it away to somebody, that's not benefiting us. So here's a description. There's also a description of a similar utility in Michigan that approached it in the same way. And then there's a technical sheet about this fiber equipment that is installed in Vermont by Velco.
Okay.
You've seen this years ago. You memorized it, right?
Absolutely.
There'll be a quiz.
We'll duplicate and distribute.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I think that is it. Obviously, this is getting a little more complicated than it started.
Can I make a follow-up comment to Casey's comments?
The case.
Is that
Well,
right?
you can have something, yeah. I'm not doing a rebut, but
No, and there's
Okay.
no rebuttal here. I just wanted to make it clear to the committee that the FCC funding that was made available, that the Capstone agencies applied for, was not available to nonprofits. So we were precluded
Was what?
for that money. You had to be a state affiliated organization. And
so you couldn't apply for
We couldn't
only the,
Right.
the,
Right. They didn't talk to us about it, so I don't really know the scope of what they applied for, but I just wanted to make it clear, we're not getting any of that federal money.
okay,
Thank you.
thank you. So much easier if the feds let us control our own destiny. No, it's the electric distribution center, which is owned right now by Green Mountain Power,
As Metro.
and Gas Metro is, it ended up being owned by Hydro Quebec pretty much. And so we put a community, because we didn't want our distribution system owned by foreign power, we put a community community representatives on the board. And
I was asking a question. Because if federal money is not available for nonprofits, how do you use the ARPA money to
oh,
integrate Velco and fire departments and rescue into a system as backup if they're nonprofits?
oh, no, I think that was
That's a
just, that
separate-
was this
that's a
grant.
separate grant
That was
program.
just the grant to administer that, what is it? Affordable ACP, whatever it stands for, connection program. The $30 a month benefit program on your $100 bill. So, yeah, that was the federal grant that might be more helpful if it helped, but we'll find that out. And we will continue this discussion. It did get way late, but dollars funding, setting up the CUDs, but we'll go back to it. Okay, have a good weekend.
Thank you.